Okay, for this one, we're going to be going over taxation regulation. Now, if you believe in Christianity, you should have an idea that taxation should be viewed as theft. Theft is viewed as the eighth commandment, and it should be viewed as being very, very serious to violate. Because when you're stealing from someone, it should be viewed as very, very wrong. Now, it doesn't matter that you say, oh, this person deserves it more than someone else. Regulation is essentially doing it from the back end, because you're essentially stealing from someone in the back end by limiting their ability to actually make income by creating some type of barrier to it, and or limiting their actual freedom to actually live their life as they see fit. Now we're going to eliminate the whole thing on abortion, because some people consider it as a regulation, some people consider it as a violation of a right to life. So we're going to go around that with it because of that whole issue, because it's a little bit of a gray area, and I think it needs to be kind of avoided, because there is some kind of in-between areas. And since I am completely pro-life, that is something where I would say it's not, you really don't have a right to terminate someone else's life. As if you look at the Declaration of Independence, it really does guarantee people a right to life. And by taking someone else's life, you're actually violating that God-given right. So that would essentially eliminate anything on abortion. So if someone does die within the process of birth naturally, that is a different case. But if someone dies from the actual abortion process, that should be viewed as a willful homicide. Now there are certain cases, like if the mother's life is in danger, it's an actual medical decision to save the mother's life, but otherwise than that, it should not be viewed as any possible option. I might be viewing this in a little bit of an extreme manner than other people, but that's really where I kind of sit. Most people are going to say, well, what about for incest, or in the case of incest or rape? And I still feel it's still a life. And if you view in the cases of such things as dogs or cats or even royalty in the past, there have been what I call cases where they've been perfectly fine. So basically, I don't view that we should essentially exterminate people just because of unforeseen circumstances. And even in the case of rape, I mean, essentially you can make them pay for the child for the act that they did, and have them pay child support, and but while still being banned, because they're essentially viewed as a threat because of that. So essentially, you can essentially get support from that if you're worried about that point. But actually, onto the ideas of taxation and regulation. When it comes to taxation, is anything other than a voluntary tax, being a consumption tax or a state, or something like a state sales tax or local sales tax, it has to be viewed as theft. Because when we're talking about the actual theft itself, is you're taking something without someone's consent. There is no voluntary exchange. The government isn't saying, okay, we're going to let you check off what services you want, and in return, this is the amount you're going to pay, and there's no sign-off on any contract. There was no contract ever. There's not any contract given year to year with citizens. And especially with citizens that don't earn anything, there's no statement that says, since you don't earn anything, you don't receive any services. There's nothing on that list like that. Since we don't have that, we don't. This is essentially theft, and we need to view it as such. We need to view that anything going in this manner should be viewed as theft, and any extreme measures to go into even further methods, such as the plans offered by some of these democratic socialists of wanting to add universal health care and free college, which would essentially cause numerically them to have to double the rates of everyone in the tax bracket to basically pay for it. And this might not even cover it. It might have to be a little bit higher because of the way taxation works. Because as you start to go up in rates, the actual collected amount actually starts to dip. So you might even have to go a little bit higher than that, than doubling it. But essentially you would have to have a top rate of 70% and a minimum rate of at least 20%. The minimum rate would be 20%, then the next rate would be 30%, and so on and so forth. So essentially your poorest people in the country that are probably making about $15,000 a year would have to take about 20% of their income and give it into the government. Now, if you believe in any type of justice, you should believe that that is a little bit insane. To basically say, we're going to take 20% of your income, and depending on your state, you're going to be paying between 0% if you're lucky into that state, or for your state income tax to as much as, it could be much as like 10% in certain states, or very, very close to 10%. There might even be a state over 10%. I'm not 100% sure offhand. But we could be talking like over 10% of that income as well. So we're talking like if someone's making $15,000 a year, they could be losing just within the actual time of income tax. They could be essentially spending, if they didn't claim anything, like 30% of that money. So you're talking about $3,000. If they made $15,000 during the year, they're spending another $3,000. And or sorry, I should say $4,500 during that time, just to pay for taxes. That means you're left with $11,500 to basically go over for the whole year. That's less than $1,000 a month. Now, if they actually have to pay for anything such as rent or food, or let's say a car or anything like that, or actually, let's say if they actually have to pay for sales tax for something, they're going to be completely broke. Someone making that amount of money is going to be completely broke. But hey, they have free college and free healthcare. God forbid if their healthcare drugs aren't covered on that, or God forbid they have to wait. And if they get injured and can't work during that period, they're kind of SOL, because they're basically going to be making even less money. And this is what essentially that system would cause. This is why you should always view a system that actually causes involuntary taxation as pure theft. And this is why at the worst case scenario, we should say we want the lowest amount of involuntary taxation. And at the best case scenario, we should only want consumption and sales tax systems for our taxation throughout our whole system. This means we should do our best to eliminate ideas of property tax and other types of taxation. because we shouldn't be asking for these extra free things. We should want a bare minimum government and just live on our own. And when it comes to regulation, we should not ask for regulation, because regulation is something that only helps the people who can sustain it. The people who are at the bottom cannot sustain regulation. They're the ones who basically get hit by every little regulation when it comes to being what you can put into your body. This is like the war on drugs. The war on drugs is a regulation. This is basically a two-sided regulation, basically through the criminal justice system, and the actual fact that it takes them off the actual grid and basically makes them so they have to essentially be at high risk. This puts them at high risk because they're essentially they could be consumers of drugs that could be very, very highly risky. They could be essentially working in prostitution, which is highly risky. They could be working in such things as drug dealing, which is highly risky. They could be working in gangs, which is highly risky. And all of these things are basically a nature that should be considered very, very disturbing for anybody that actually cares about their family members. And when it comes down to it, even if you don't want them getting into this point, you should at least care enough about wanting to take them out of the darkness and coming out so they can actually get themselves some help, because they won't otherwise, and they're actually at risk of becoming one of these victims of when you hear about these serial killers. Because when it comes to homicide always happens to the most vulnerable of the people. And these people are going to be vulnerable when they're seen as easy targets. The most easy targets are the ones that people that are going to be basically seen as the ones who are hidden off the grid. And those are the types of people who are most likely to be murdered. And that this is the whole problem we need to look at. Now, when we look at the situation of other regulations, we should look at why we're doing them, like banking regulations. More banking regulations only hurt the actual people. We need to look at decentralizing the actual ability with banking and finance, because we don't want the actual people at the top to basically make money off of the system that basically the government creates. We essentially want to basically create an even system to where everybody has access to a fair purchasing price. This means you need to essentially decentralize the whole system. This means you need to get rid of all types of centralization in this system, and that means zero regulations. You need to go, and if you want any type of, if you say, oh, that sounds scary, you're able to get rid of that scary factor by tying it to a currency that would be gold and silver. When you make gold and silver your currency, there is nothing to worry about. This is something that has been around for thousands of years. This goes well back before even some of the earliest times that we can remember. And this has been able to maintain wealth even and as countries have actually denied the usage of gold and silver, that's when the countries have actually fallen. Countries that have actually continued with these usage of gold and silver have actually maintained their actual system. And when you do that, you're going to realize that you don't need all these regulations, because it keeps everything in check. It makes sure that you're not spending more than comes in, because everything is essentially based on an actual real currency that has value. And then you can't go beyond debt, because you can't print your way out of debt. There is no loan capability, because you only can trade what's there. You only have access to what comes in. There is no raising a debt ceiling, because there is no debt ceiling. You would essentially you only have access to what comes in. You have to pay off your loans, and you have to essentially only buy what comes in. This would put the government on some serious strains when it comes to spending, and they would not be able to spend any more than comes in. When it comes to the actual people, they're going to maintain their actual purchase power, and there cannot be any manipulation, because you cannot manipulate the actual price of gold, as it's going to maintain its own value. And the actual market's going to create its own value as people decide what the actual consumer cost of living is naturally, not through actual manipulation, by deciding what products are going to be in the consumer price index this time around, instead of trying to kind of work it around. Because they can't say, hey, we're going to put because automobiles are actually reducing in price, we're going to put them in there to keep the to show the inflation rates much lower than it really is. So we're going to put them in there to actually show it's lower. And we're going to eliminate a lot of grocery items that have actually gone up. And we're going to keep these grocery items in there that have actually not moved in a while. So then we can get this real low inflation rate. And they wouldn't be able to do that, because the fact is the inflation rate would actually be determined by the actual market itself. And the actual currency would actually adjust accordingly, meaning you would not be losing purchase power, which would be a great thing for the actual consumer. Now, while the finance and banking industry wouldn't exactly benefit as much as they did in the over the past century, it would actually be beneficial for everyone. When it comes down to the actual idea of regulation on the way they handle a lot of the systems for what people have access to for decisions on pharmaceuticals, you'd see that basically this is another thing that needs to be completely deregulated. You would essentially replace it the same way we do as with electronics, where we have a third-party system or multiple third-party systems like underwriter laboratories for electronics, and you'd see that this would replace the whole idea of what we would have out there, and that people would have both A, the right to try if it's untested in the case of terminal patients, or B, they would basically have these third-party groups that are not political, that are not being paid off by these pharmaceutical groups to hold back generics, which have been a huge major thing, where you get them to hold back generics, and you get these groups to basically give huge donations to certain political leaders to essentially make sure that this happens, both political leaders and to the FDA, to ensure that this happens. And this is why the FDA gets huge sums of money from these groups, both in donations and for this so-called testing period, which usually lasts a year, which costs about $1 billion. Now, when they pay this money with it, as they can be passed and they can be actually denied, which is kind of bogus, because they've done most of the testing themselves. All they need to do is basically get a stamp of approval. Now, the stamp of approval should easily be done, but in most cases it's not, and that's where you get a lot of this bureaucratic garbage. And if we really want to go toward freedom, we really need to essentially deregulate all of this nonsense and go toward where people can make their own decisions. If you look in the Constitution, you don't find any area out there that says basically that they have the right to regulate every aspect of people's lives, and that they have the and you will not find one iota in there that shows they have the right for income tax. They have the right to tax, but income tax was not specifically ratified. Now, this makes it a huge big deal, because income tax is one of the ways that they take money from people. Now, if you look at that, is income is even a variable word, because income usually meant money from a sale, not actually money from labor from another person. That's another issue. Now, if you look at that, the definitions is that makes it even another gray area, which is something where income tax is technically not even legal, and even beyond that, taxing labor is even less legal, which is where we're at now. If someone stops paying that, they're going to say you're going to go to jail. Why? Oh, because we passed the law. Well, the law is not constitutional, but when it comes into court, they go, we're just going to hold up the precedent. Meanwhile, it's actually not constitutional. And this is where we're sitting at. Because what happens with judges is they'd rather have precedent, which means we're not going to essentially say that what Congress did was illegal by actually just basically saying we want another way of grabbing money. We're basically going to we're not going to essentially challenge them, which is why what you see is you'll see a lot of legislating from the bench, which is what happened with the ACA, which is a classic case, where essentially to keep the law alive, they voted in one way for it to be a tax, and in the other way for it to be an actual regulation. And the reason why is because if you have it as one as an actual as one or the other with it, is basically, if it's the way it was passed, that basically you have to have because it's where it started, it has to have a certain way for it to be passed. So what they wanted to do, they wanted to basically make sure that it didn't have to go through when it was challenged, because what could have happened was it could have essentially been sent back and it could have failed, and they did not want this happening to a potential sitting president. Instead of actually saying, hey, this is unconstitutional, this can't sit. And this is where things happen, is we have a judicial system that'll say, hey, we don't want to get in the middle of things, and we'd rather just let the law sit, instead of actually saying this is not constitutional, and this violates actual individual liberties. And basically, and that's where we sit. What essentially should be done by these judges, if anything violates either of the two major founding documents, it should be thrown out. Anything. It doesn't matter if someone starts whining and crying at the top of their lungs. They should be basically told, no, this is the way things go. And we need to assert ourselves as a constitutional republic. We're not a democracy. It doesn't matter if Bernie Sanders calls us a democracy, or if any of the Democrats call ourselves a democracy, or Republicans call ourselves a democracy. We are a constitutional republic. This is what makes ourselves different, and this is why it's a lot different. It's actually separated into three branches, and it's not the two houses of Congress like AOC thinks it is, and the president. That's not the three branches of government. I know it's funny. I know it's become a meme because of how dumb she is when it comes to actually knowing about the government. But it's actually the judicial, the legislative, and the executive. When it comes down to it, is you cannot have a judicial that has executive deference. When you have executive deference, this causes a serious problem in the way liberty is retained for the people. You cannot have executive deference or legislative deference for it. Each group needs to basically guard their power extremely strongly, because what ends up happening is that if they go weak, what ends up you will find that one group is going to end up taking over. You're going to find that when you get a weak legislative body, you're going to find that the executive is going to go to war over nothing. And we found that with the Obama administration, how they felt that they had the right to go to war because the UN said so. And this is what was coming out of the administration. They said the UN gave them the authority. And as far as I'm concerned, the UN gives them no authority. And then when it comes down to the legislative basically needs to understand that when they pass things, that it needs to be signed into law and it needs to be constitutional. It doesn't matter how much they will something to pass. It needs to be passed. It needs to be signed off by the executive, and it needs to be basically verified by the judicial branch as being constitutional. And then when it comes to the judicial branch, the judicial branch needs to basically go after the executive and the legislative branches and tell them when they're violating the Constitution, and give them a fair warning of this, and tell them on countless times. Tell them that basically they should have told them with the ACA that that's a clear violation. They should even notify them with such things as universal health care is a clear violation of the First Amendment for the right to associations. And that would essentially eliminate that and eliminate their freedom to basically buy health care with it, because they're talking about eliminating the right to buy private health care. This is what's coming out of Kamala Harris's mouth. And this is where you're finding regulations coming out of these people's mouths. This is why regulations are bad. They're theft. This is basically theft from business, which ends up going to theft from people. It robs people of money. Taxation is the same thing. It's theft. And when we're talking about theft, I think we can all agree that theft is wrong. I don't care if you're a billionaire or the bum down the street that's asking voluntarily for coins. If you steal from that bum down the street, it's the same thing as stealing from the billionaire on Wall Street. You're stealing. Stealing is wrong. I think we can look at moral issues in a black and white issue that way, because theft is theft. It doesn't matter what you're doing it for and why you're doing it. I mean, unless you're basically saying we're taking down the actual government for what it's stealing from the people, like in the case of the story of Robin Hood, where he was attacking the actual government for stealing from the people. This is not the case. This is basically the prince trying to steal money from the people. This is what AOC and Bernie Sanders are trying to do to the people. And they're trying to offer them a horrible bill of goods that nobody wants. And this is what continues to happen. And certain people are falling for it, but eventually you end up getting with Venezuela, and that's the end result. Venezuela was once one of the richest countries, and now they're one of the poorest. And we're having some idiots talk about intervention, while other people are saying, let's leave them alone. And this is just the case with it. They wouldn't be in this matter if they didn't accept socialism from some snake oil salesman out there. And some Hollywood celebrities that go, hey, this is a pretty good idea. Because they didn't have to deal with it. They were able to go back to a capitalist society that didn't have to deal with that garbage. And this is why we should basically be rejecting any idea of more taxation, more regulation. We should be going with the idea of trying to eliminate as much as possible. We shouldn't be asking for more. We should be asking for less. Now, if you like this, like it, subscribe, and click the bell for the notifications. And since this is my third one for today, I will see you guys all tomorrow. Bye.